Thanks, Greg.
All right, welcome back. It's good to see most of you returned. There's a few spare seats. Look, we've got a very short period of time here to cover the meaty bits of the report. What we're going to do now is quickly skim through the key findings and the recommendations. I appreciate this is going to be fairly high level, and once again, you will have seen some of this in the odd slide from what the Commissioner's video. But we'll try and stick to the tight timeline and leave it open for some questions at the end if we can. So I guess the first point is, this will be high level, and I think we'll start with Chad.
What I'm going to do is seek to create what I think is a bit of a bridge between the executive summary and the rest of the report. I'll give you some page numbers as I go, given that that appears to be my special power. Recommendation 1, you'll see the recommendations above on the slide. There's a reference to simplifying mining approvals. That's a reference to finding 17, which you'll find at page 21. There was a key idea here that there are overlapping licensing and authorisation processes for uranium mining in Australia. The overlap arises because there are both requirements to be licensed under state law as well as under Commonwealth law for uranium mining. That does not apply for a wide range of other mining activities, notwithstanding the fact that the mining process is very similar, and that particularly in the case of underground mining. The Commission's view, and this is explained, was that there was not a lot of evidence that the additional process offered advantages. It rather duplicated assessments, gave rise to different timelines and duplicated conditions on approvals, and there was some evidence given about that. There were some submissions on that question as well. The view was expressed that that had a significant effect on the ability to develop new mines and the time taken, notwithstanding the fact that both of the bodies approved the mine. So there was a recommendation that's directed precisely to that issue. If you're interested in interrogating that more, go to page 21 and finding 17 and the discussion that's there, and you can then work your way out from the footnotes. And when you look in the footnotes, you'll see who the people were that said it and why that was the case. But the basis for the Commission's view is set out in the explanation at that point. In saying all of this and giving you the references, I'm not discouraging you. A number of people have told me that they've read the report a couple of times, for which I'm grateful. But you'll need to read, the context helps, but that's the precise point. I'll deal with recommendations 2 and 3 together. They deal with the enhancement of the enhancement of the geophysical data set and the need for further geophysical survey. You'll find this in finding 15 on page 20. The key point here is that exploration activity, and indeed because exploration activity precedes mine development by a decade or more, is driven by the availability of what is known as the pre-competitive data set. Now this is in South Australia, a system that's operated by the Department of State Development called SARIG. It is all of the historical information that's been done with respect to mining activity in South Australia, including the results of commercial activities that have been returned to the government, as well as also government's geophysical surveys, aerial and other techniques that it's used. This is very, very significant for people because they seek to reduce their exploration risk by interrogating this data set. The issue was that what's there is great and it's apparently highly regarded, but there are big gaps in what is known. And if you want to have a look, there's a map on page 20 which in fact shows all the drill holes that have ever been taken in the state. What won't appear from the scale of the map is that some of those drill holes are only 5 centimetres wide. And there are significant parts of the state on which there are very few drill holes. And there was some significant evidence on that. We're talking about tens of thousands of square kilometres that have one drill hole in them. The issue here was that there was a need, in the view of the Commission, to improve the integration of the availability of the data set. That is, there's disparate bodies of information which, in the view of a number of geoscientists, could be integrated together in more sophisticated systems. to allow multiple data sets to be overlapped. The second view was that there was a need to engage and expand the range of geophysical survey work that had been done to improve its resolution. That, in essence, allows new techniques to be used, or for old techniques to be used with a high degree of accuracy. Combined, the Commission was of the view that that was of an advantage, and that's the explanation for those recommendations. Recommendation 4 concerns government support in the exploration of greenfield locations. The issue here is that most exploration activity occurs in brownfield sites. Brownfield sites are around existing mines where mining companies are seeking to prove the size of their existing resource or to direct their further activities. Greenfield exploration is in a new area and it is high risk. That is, it's commercially high risk because the probabilities of success are low and the costs of exploration activity are high. There is a government program in place. I'm just being reminded of the time. There's a government program in place to encourage further exploration, and the idea here is that PACE, which is this program, be supported to allow counter-cyclical investment, that is, during periods of downturns. Recommendation 5 concerned decommissioning costs being secured by guarantee. The short story here is that all new mines in South Australia are required to be secured with guarantees that are calculated by the Department for State Development, and amounts are paid in. The issue here was this was not standard practice at the time of the Olympic Dam development, and in fairness to BHP, their evidence was that there is provision in their financial accounts to pay for the full cost of decommissioning, but in the view of the Commission, all future mines should have their decommissioning costs secured by guarantee, and that's explained at finding 13 on page 17. I'll be very quick on the topic of further processing. The findings with respect to further processing were to the effect that the further processing activities of conversion, enrichment and fuel fabrication were in principle not viable, given not only the assessment of their viability but certain barriers to entry. But the view was that combined with a waste facility, that is if there was a deep geological facility, there would be the opportunity for South Australia to link up its mining activity with some of these other further processing activities which are necessary to make fuel, as Greg explained. The fact is that cannot occur in Australia at the moment. That is, that such a commercial possibility could not even be licensed because there is a prohibition under Commonwealth law that restricts or prevents such a licence being granted by the Commonwealth Minister. And the view was that were these activities to be explored, and in the view of the Commission there would be some question of viability, the fact was that that could not proceed while that prohibition was in place. Now, that wasn't to say that there wouldn't still need to be a licensing process, but the fact is the Minister is prohibited by statute from even licensing. And the final recommendation concerned the utilisation of the cyclotron in the building in which we're in. The evidence here, this is a nuclear medicine related recommendation. There is a cyclotron in the building below us. It is used for generating radiopharmaceuticals for hospitals in South Australia, particularly fluorine. There is evidence that there is the capacity to expand its use, particularly with training other people to use cyclotrons and equipment, but also to develop radionuclides for nuclear medicine, particularly where there is not a research reactor in that country. And the view was that there was an opportunity for its increased utilisation for a commercial purpose. So that's the reason for recommendation 7.
Right, I'm going to talk to you about the electricity generation findings and recommendations, principally set out in chapter 4 of the report, and there's some relevant appendices which I'll refer to as well. We started by understanding what nuclear power generation was. It's a pretty mature technology. Many other countries around the world have been using it for decades now. It's a technology that produces a lot of power from a relatively small power source. And because it's not actually burning anything, it uses fission to heat the water, to spin the turbines, to create the electricity. In terms of its greenhouse gas emissions, it's comparable as a clean energy source with wind and solar power. We spent a bit of time looking at greenhouse gas emissions from nuclear power generation because that's a field that we understood was fairly contentious, and we were satisfied based on a number of life cycle studies, so studies looking at the full range of nuclear power generation from mining into decommissioning, that in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions, it can be considered to be equivalent to wind and solar.
Can I ask a question at that point? It's not clear in here, and I've read it a couple of times, whether that includes the mining of the uranium.
Yes, it does. It's addressed principally in Chapter 1 and in the footnotes in the Energy Future section. And the study that we relied on particularly was one undertaken most recently in the United States by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where they looked at life cycle greenhouse gas analyses over a number of energy generation sources.
And it indeed was relied on by the IPCC.
So, on page 3 in chapter 1, where you talk about one-third, it talks about the first third being manufacturing of nuclear fuel, but it doesn't actually talk about the mining. So it just wasn't clear there.
No, it does include the mining.
The next principal issue in the electricity generation chapter is, of course, the assessment of the risks of nuclear power generation. This is an area, obviously, that is well known in terms of the potential risks of when things go wrong and nuclear accidents happen. Based principally on what we understand from both Chernobyl, Fukushima and less well known as the near miss at 3 Mile Island. So the Commission spent some time looking at those accidents, how they were caused, what was learned from them, really through the lens of trying to understand, does this mean that we could not recommend that South Australia even consider nuclear power generation as an option? Is it just that unsafe that it really should be ruled out? And where the Commission's findings came out on that was, no, that wasn't the case. A lot of lessons have been learned from these incidents. A lot of design elements are now being introduced into new nuclear reactor designs, which mean that they are what's called in the industry passively safe. There is also a lot of work has been done in terms of operational safety culture as a result of learnings from Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island and in particular Fukushima. Based on everything that was learned from the studies, the experts that we spoke to and the overseas visits, the Commission came out that nuclear power generation is not something that should be taken off the table. It can be safely managed. You need a very strong independent regulator to be able to do that safely, but it's not something that's beyond South Australians in a technical feasibility sense to be able to consider. The critical discussion within Chapter 4 around nuclear power generation is really towards its commercial viability. Would a nuclear power plant, if built in South Australia, actually be able to make money? Is it something that makes sense in a commercial sense? And we had to look very closely at the system and market into which a nuclear power plant would sell power to be able to understand that. And in Australia, that's the national electricity market, which is the interconnected network of poles and wires, which connects the predominantly eastern states, Tasmania and South Australia. And we needed to understand very carefully how that worked. And in particular in the South Australian sub-region, so that we knew that if a nuclear power plant were to be built here in South Australia and start operating, best case scenario, say around 2030, would it actually be able to make money given the network that it would be integrated into? Long answer short, there are lots of peculiarities about the South Australian submarket of the NEM, which pose significant challenges to a large, what's called baseload generator, like nuclear power. It would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, based on current market operations, for an energy generator like a nuclear power plant to be commercially viable here in South Australia. Now, if things change in certain respects, for example, if there is very strong action on climate change, such that a strong carbon price is introduced, that equation starts to look a bit different. If there are changes in terms of the capital costs that are involved in nuclear power construction and operation, which are significant. It's very, very complex technology, and the safety requirements mean that it's very expensive to build and regulate. If those costs can be brought down, again, the equation starts to change a little bit. And when the Commission was investigating this area, we looked a lot at the connection between climate change policy and energy policy, because this is an area that's undergoing amazing amounts of change at the moment. We're seeing a lot of renewables being brought in, which is fantastic. We're seeing things like storage starting to come online. We're hearing about electric vehicles. We're hearing about people going off grid. All of these things are changing and moving and are going to have impacts on the way electricity is going to be generated and delivered in the future. And what the Commission really came out at in terms of a finding was that there needs to be a plan. There needs to be a state and a national plan that connects our energy policy and our climate change policy in a rational and sensible way, so that there is a pathway as to how we're going to meet those very, very difficult challenges of greenhouse gas reduction based on the targets that were set in Paris last year. So the recommendations that are generated by the electricity findings are really much more policy oriented. They're signals to government to think about these things more broadly. Think about how you're going to construct a low carbon, reliable and lowest possible cost electricity system into the future, given all these changes that are happening. And given the findings on the safety, don't take nuclear off the table. It might make sense. You don't want to be left with no options. You want all the options available to you as you investigate this further. So that's really where the recommendations came out at. Take the existing prohibitions on nuclear power generation away to allow this to be further explored. Develop a more comprehensive national policy about low carbon, reliable, low cost electricity, and keep an eye on the newer reactor designs that are coming through, particularly for smaller reactors, which are starting to be at the final stages of development and may well be commercialised in the next decade. If those reactor designs are potentially as cheap as their vendors say they might be, the commercial equation starts to look a little bit different.
So I guess now with respect to the back end or the management and storage of waste, I mean, what the Commission found was that there was significant economic opportunities to provide services to manage, store and dispose of nuclear waste, specifically used fuel and intermediate level waste. South Australia has some unique characteristics not shared by many other places in the world that make it well suited to this sort of an activity, including its geology, its hydrology, stability in terms of political stability and seismic stability, as well as Australia's strong credentials with respect to non-proliferation and some of these other considerations. As I said, there's not too many places around the world that actually shares all those characteristics in the one place. If this is done right, what the Commission believed is that there is significant benefit both now and for future generations. And we'll talk a bit more about that in terms of the economics, which is where the focus of that statement is in a minute. However, for this to actually be realised requires the community to agree to this. And Lucy will talk more about this a little bit later on. But clearly, if we don't want to do this, we don't agree as a community, then there's not much point pushing too far with it. However, it should be noted, and this was the subject of a couple of the recommendations, is that, as Chad mentioned, there are currently legal prohibitions both at a state level and at a federal level, not just to do this, but to even explore it in much more detail. So one of the questions, or one of the recommendations, was that some of this legislation be repealed to enable a thorough and informed analysis of this and to provide more detail that's clearly needed. if we're to make an informed decision about whether or not to go further forward. Next slide. So just really quickly, I wanted to zone in on what it is we're talking about. This picture is a picture of the nuclear fuel system. And in essence, if you look at the little yellow dot there, that's the fuel pellet that comes out of the enrichment process. That little pellet goes into a long skinny tube, zirconium-clad tube. By the way, that little pellet's about that big. So a lot of these little pellets go into this big skinny tube. A bunch of these skinny tubes get put together into a fuel assembly, which is what's depicted next to the picture of a man there. And it's that fuel assembly that goes into the reactor to actually produce the heat. So, yes, this diagram is in the report somewhere, with an explanation, much more detailed explanation than I'm going to give you. But in essence, once those fuel assemblies have been producing energy and producing power for, it could be up to 2 to 5 years. So there's a lot of energy in these things, and they last quite a while. It's page 199 for those that want to have a look. So after it's been in the reactor for a significant period of time producing power, it starts to lose its effectiveness, and it's at that point that it's removed from the reactor and it's put into a pool of water, which is literally adjacent to the reactor. So it's on the reactor site, which is what's depicted just down the bottom right-hand corner there. This used fuel is very hot and it's very radioactive. So it's not stuff you want to play around with. It sits in that cooling pond for about 10 years to cool down. And it's at that point, once it's sufficiently cooled, that it is taken out of those pools, it's put into canisters, and it's stored in dry casks, and we'll talk about that in a minute, for another 30 odd years. Over that period of time, it's both decaying and cooling down. And after that period of, say, 40 or 50 years, it's then basically at a point where you could start to bury it below ground. And there's a number of different configurations of these, but essentially that's what we're talking about here. Next slide.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Do you conceive of having a low level and an intermediate level waste? Sorry, Melissa? Do you conceive of having a low level and intermediate level waste and not having a high level waste operation? We produce very little high level level radiation in Australia, and at the moment we wouldn't have a need for that in this country. So is it going to be all or none, or are we going to have low level and intermediate level and then not? Is that a plan? Is that a policy?
There's 2 points there. Yes, Australia does have some low level waste and some associated intermediate level waste as a result of the reactor at Lucas Heights in Sydney. So we have a reactor clearly that does produce some of this waste. Small amounts of it though. And hospitals and universities and elsewhere produce low level waste. But that is something that the Commonwealth government needs to deal with, and it was a process that they're going through. So for those that have been listening to the news, the activity in the northern part of South Australia at the moment is largely around trying to find a site to deal with low-level waste. And low and intermediate level waste. What we're talking about here, though, is not that. So I guess in a sense, this is all or nothing, because without nuclear power plants themselves here in Australia, we're not going to be producing this sort of waste. So what we're talking about here is bringing used fuel in from other countries, shipping it in and managing, storing it and disposing of it here. So in that sense, we don't have to do this. So I go back to what I said before. This, in the Commission's view, is an economic opportunity for the state. Now, whether the state wants to do that and wants to pursue that, that's the question, I guess, that you've all been challenged with. But so what was it that we actually modelled in this respect? If we look at the diagram up here, basically, once the fuel had spent that 10 years in the pool at the reactor sites in other countries, it would then be put into a large canister and shipped to South Australia. So this is what we actually modelled in our financial and modelling. So it would be shipped to South Australia in a purpose-built ships, would be delivered to a new purpose-built, single-use wharf somewhere in South Australia, would then be stored in these large containers, which are about 140-tonne steel concrete containers, so that we're not talking about small light stuff here, on a large concrete pad. It could be undercover, it could be out in the open. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. Not far from the port, and it would be basically left there to continue the cooling down if it hadn't already cooled down sufficiently before it was shipped out here. Now, that would then allow us to generate revenue, because part of the deal would be ship doesn't pull up until the check's in the bank. With that revenue, we would be able to fund the construction of a deep geological storage facility, which is the bottom right-hand picture there. And in order to get it from the interim storage facility to the deep geological storage facility, there would be a dedicated rail system, so dedicated rail line and track. Now, we've assumed in our modelling that this would all be new, it would all be dedicated, it wouldn't be used for any other purpose. And we did that to be conservative in our analysis. It's not essential. I mean, you could leverage existing infrastructure if you wanted to. That might reduce the cost. But for our purposes, we just assumed, in essence, the worst case, the most expensive way that you could do this, and it was all new stuff.
I've just got a question from
Sure.
a juror who's requested not to be photographed, so I'm asking on her behalf. How much water is used for cooling down?
Well, the first point is we'd probably have to ask the reactor sites, because they're the ones that do the cooling. So what we're proposing here is not having any pools, so there's no water required in that sense. If you actually have a look at page 91, you'll see a picture of what it is, what it would potentially look like here at the interim storage facility in South Australia. So it's air-cooled. Once it gets here, it's all air-cooled. So we're not talking about significant water use. Sure.
We've got to let everyone hear you. At what stage were you thinking that they would seal the high-level waste in either synrock or glass or any of those things? Would the people who are sending us the stuff have to pay for that, or would we have to pay for that to do it for ourselves here? Because nowadays those things are all in sealed glass or whatever, ceramic sorts of containers.
So just to clear one thing up, synrock, or the vitrification, the glass process, is the end result of a reprocessing process. So we're not talking about receiving stuff necessarily that's been through that process. We have assumed that it would come to us in the form that you saw in that diagram beforehand. So it would basically be contained in the assemblies, in the form that it in essence came out of the reactor, just that it had gone through a period of radioactive decay and cooling.
I'm just going to
Okay,
ask
sorry Greg, we've got 7 minutes.
Okay, if we've got 7 minutes, I'm going to power through a couple of other slides here and hopefully leave you 1 or 2 minutes for questions. Next slide.
just while that slide jumps, I just had a follow-up question from that questioner. With regards to cooling down, it related to nuclear power generation, not the storage diagram. So could you address how much water is required in cooling down were you to pursue generation?
I suggest you have a look at the report because there is a discussion about what's involved in nuclear power plants, but noting that the Commission did not make a recommendation that we should be building nuclear power plants here. It's probably more of an academic question than the one we need to focus on just at the moment. But very simple terms, depends. Can use quite a lot of water, which is why you see some of those nuclear power plants, built on the coast. But it's not nuclear power is not something that we're talking about here for South Australia. What's this show you up here? This basically underpins the principles, the safety principles that are important. In essence, safety is assured, and now I'm talking about deep geological storage here. Safety is essentially assured through understanding the geology, the barriers, we'll talk about that in a minute, and to understand the radiological processes. We'll talk about that too. As I said, very hot, radioactive when it comes out, actually. Before I get to that, before we go there, what we're showing up here in this slide is, in essence, the canister that these assemblies would go into to be buried in the ground. So the yellow canister there is a gas-tight, watertight canister. It could be 5 or more centimetres of copper with concrete and steel linings on the inside, and basically that's the form that it would be buried in underground. And what we rely on here is that the radionuclides, which are still inherent in the used fuel, is actually contained within that canister system. That canister is then buried below ground and is surrounded with bentonite clay. The purpose of that is to retard the ingress of water, to obviously try and prevent corrosion and the like of the canister. And if the canister is actually damaged or is breached or penetrated in some way, that it retards the migration of the radionuclides out into the environment. Essentially, the bentonite clay, a lot of these radionuclides stick to the clay, so it doesn't pass readily through it. And then finally, we provide an even greater barrier from humans and the environment by burying it 300 to 500 metres or so below ground. And even if it does get past the bentonite clay, it migrates over thousands and thousands of years very slowly out and disperses as it goes. And if it ever reaches the top, it's in trace quantities. So that's the general concept of this multi-barrier system. Next slide.
When it's at port and you're just holding it at port, what are the risks involved with that?
Well, I guess it's on a slab. There'd be some security risks, so it'd be fenced off and secured in that sense, so you wouldn't want people getting into it. Bearing in mind that this is in 140-tonne containers, which they drive, they test, and there's some good videos on YouTube if you want to have a look. I mean, one test was driving, if you can go back one. No, we'll get to that. Yeah, sorry, they drive trains into it 160 kilometres an hour and the train bounces off. They fire missiles into it. So these are inherently fairly secure in their own right. But that's probably the major concern.
Just as well contained in those containers that it is in those canisters, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. So
5 minutes.
noting that I'm rapidly running out of time here. By the way, this is important stuff, and I really recommend that you do spend the time understanding this and reading up about it, because this is what you really need to satisfy yourselves with. What this is trying to depict here is that, in essence, when this stuff comes out of the reactor, as I said, it's quite radioactive, highly radiotoxic. It's nasty stuff. But it decays relatively rapidly. That's the nature of radiation. So that, after about 50 years out of the reactor, it's in the order of 80% less radiotoxic than it was when it started. After about 100 years, it's down to around, 3%. And, by the time you get to about 1,000 years and out to 10,000 years, it's pretty damn close to natural background uranium that's already in the ground. Still slightly more radiotoxic, but we're starting to get down to similar levels to what exists naturally. And the main point here is that that's primarily in the first instance what those canisters need to guarantee, is that it can contain this stuff for periods of up to 1,000, 10,000 years to prevent, while they're still reasonably radiotoxic, from migrating.
Just to...
Sorry?
Sorry. At what point does it become high level to intermediate level?
No, what we're talking about here will always be high level in essence. Well, I mean, after 1,000 years or so, you probably argue whether it's... But technically, this is all high level waste. Intermediate level waste that we're talking about is stuff like, it might be some of the concrete and the piping that was used to actually construct the reactor. So over time, it gets irradiated and becomes more radioactive, clearly, than natural iron ore and concrete. So that's the nature of what we call intermediate level waste. Okay. So the other point to note is the green bits there in those little circles are fission products. They're the really nasty things, and those fission products decay much more quickly than the heavier transuranics, they're called. After about 300 to 500 years, essentially, pretty much all of those fission products have totally decayed. So they're no longer inherent in the in those fuel assemblies. So this is critical. This, married with the engineering barriers, married with the geology, is what's used together to build the safety case, to satisfy communities and regulators and others that this is, this is safe enough to do.
Greg, I've just got one quick question here.
Hi, Greg.
Hi.
I was wondering the volume of waste that there's financial figures in here, but to make this feasible, to make this a profitable project, how many thousands of tonnes?
Okay, so what we modelled, and this was the maximum capacity that we modelled, was at the completion of and closure of the deep geological storage site, 138,000 tonnes of heavy metal. What's that mean? By the way, this would be 2090-ish by the time we were closing this. That would equate to, in the order of somewhere between 6 and 13% of the world's inventory of nuclear waste. And why do I say 6 to 13%? Is that we modelled, or we assumed in our modelling, that no more nuclear power plants would be built after 2030. So we only included an assumption that reactors that were currently in existence or were planned to be built between now and then were actually built, and there was nothing after that.
Okay.
Yep, so I was about to get on that. The minimum, we did some analysis on that. We thought that you'd need about 15,500 tonnes. So at the price that we assumed we would get, in order to ensure that the state wasn't left out of pocket here, and there was actually a little bit of benefit to the state and the community. Much less than that, then you wouldn't do this. You wouldn't even contemplate it. So, and clearly the other point is that if that's all you got, clearly the benefits that we're going to talk about in a minute would be smaller. Okay.
So, Greg, because you asked so nicely, I'm giving you another 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much. Because I'm powering. Enough said about that one. Next. Radiation. We talked about this earlier, but basically the safety case that all these countries that are pursuing deep geological storage, so Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, etc., all have to convince their regulators that at no point under a whole bunch of what-if scenarios that a person standing on the top... Okay. Sorry, I'm under pressure for time as well as... we'll get you the time. We'll get you the... There we go. 133. So what's this diagram trying to show? It's basically showing on the left-hand side there the background radiation levels, which we talked about earlier. The far left, that's the range of background in the UK. The smaller dark blue one just to the right of that is Australia, background radiation. The light blue one there is the amount of radiation you'd get if you go and have a chest CT scan. The dotted line is basically the regulatory limit that most countries set to say, listen, if you're in the nuclear space in some form or other, you should try and maintain or minimise additional exposure to the community to less than 1 millisievert, which is that dotted line. And the ones out to the right are basically the sorts of levels that nuclear facilities around the world actually would produce over and above background. Now, to put that into context, if the safety case for a geological storage site is 0.1 of a millisievert, that's right over on the far right-hand side. It's orders of magnitude less than natural background radiation. And the safety case, all these what-if scenarios, what if all the canisters, are breached and are ruptured early on in the piece and, they escape through the barriers and the like, would the dose that would be received on the surface, immediately above, exceed that 0.1 millisievert? And under nearly all, bar probably one example, it's in the order of hundreds of times less than that limit. The exception, or probably the worst case, is if somebody with a drill rig managed to send their drill rig into one of these canisters and bought the core sample from the middle of the canister up, then clearly the operator of that drill rig is going to get themselves a much higher dose. And that wouldn't be necessarily a good thing, particularly if it happened early on after it had been buried. Maybe less of an issue in 10,000 years' time. But notwithstanding that, the impact on the environment still, in a general sense, remains below that 0.1 millisievert. So that's the sort of stuff that the proponents need to go through and prove to the regulators that this could be done safe. And once again, a lot more information in the book about that. Next. Economic modelling, look, we believe it's conservative. You do your own homework on that. In the order of 100 billion in profits could be generated under what we believe were very conservative assumptions. On top of that, in addition to that, there was another 32 billion set aside separately to decommission and monitor this facility infinitum. If those profits were put into a state wealth fund, which we would recommend, which is sufficiently ring-fenced so that politicians couldn't get their greasy hands on them, and that it was invested in productive infrastructure or investments at a return of about 4%, which is what we assumed, much like a lot of other sovereign wealth funds around the world. Our future fund, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Singaporean, etc. So at that return, if we left 50% of that annual income in the fund so that it benefited from compound growth, and the other 50% was given to the Treasurer so that we could all have, we could spend it each year, then in essence, this fund would continue to grow in in perpetuity for the benefit of not just our generation, but generations for, in theory, ever. Look, and noting the time, I really can't go into much more of it, but there's a reasonably detailed discussion in the report about our assumptions. There's a couple of underlying reports, one done by Jacobs, a couple of other summaries, which go into a lot more detail. This is high level, it was conceptual. We did sensitivity analysis, what if we don't get the price we want? What if we only get a fraction of the volume? What if, Appendix J is what I'd point you to. And under all that analysis, we still found that this was likely to be highly viable and beneficial. Okay, next.
I might just talk for 1 minute, if I can, about social consent, just because I think it's a really important finding of the Commission. It was something that, obviously there was a lot of technical analysis, a lot of economic analysis that went into the report. What surprised me throughout the process was the learnings around how important it is to not just understand the technology and the economics, but to bring a community along with any one of these types of proposals. We looked at a lot of international case studies where countries had attempted to site nuclear facilities and waste disposal facilities in particular, if they weren't paying as much, if not more, attention to ensuring they had community support at political but also public levels. These things don't happen. They won't get off the ground. And you're obviously all living and breathing that right now, but it actually is fundamental to the viability of one of these sorts of projects to have your ongoing, sustainable political and public support. If you don't have that, this won't happen. Obviously, you're already aware that this is not something South Australia has to do. We have the choice. It's not a problem we have to solve, we have the choice. And so we all have to think about, are we going to be better off? Are these benefits actually going to improve our lives going forward such that we'd be interested in even looking at this further? And that's, I think, the fundamental question everyone has to grapple with. And unless our politicians are assured that the South Australian public is behind it in taking those further steps to further investigate it, there really isn't going to be anything further going forward around this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, and that is that, I'm sorry we've come to it last, but I think Chapter 6 is a very, very important chapter, and of course, I'm sure it's in part the reason that you're here, and that is that we cannot underscore enough the importance of social consent, both to the activity being undertaken, if that activity is to be undertaken successfully, and also community consent, that is from a community were it minded to be interested in hosting a facility, and indeed that's the reason that we spent some time on this in Chapter 6 and indeed in Chapter 10. I wanted to particularly emphasise that in that respect, with respect to both social and community consent, that means the whole community, and that meant that there was a need to talk directly to communities, not only to you, but to the wider South Australian community and to particular communities, as the Commission itself did. And that includes talking directly to Indigenous communities and talking to the members of those communities, as, and I was present, Kevin did during the Commission process, and also our regional engagement person, John, did directly. And it will be an important feature of this process to go about having those discussions in conjunction with this. But I cannot underscore the importance of Chapter 6 and Chapter 10 together, and indeed I think it's what appears in about the second or third paragraph of the executive summary.
And I don't care about the program, so I'm going to steal another 30 seconds and click through a couple of things here. We did look at the impacts on our image and other industries. Clearly, read the report, have a look more at this, but we found, in summary, no evidence of adverse impacts. And there's a bunch of other information there related to that. We looked at transport, because clearly that's a concern of people in the community as well. Once again, we found that the risks associated with this are, or the likelihood of some of these incidents are very small, and the consequences are fairly minimal or are manageable. So once again, there's a lot more work that's been done on that, but we were quite comfortable that this is, in a transport sense, not a big issue. And we won't bother with the next steps. So, look, thank you very much for your time. I'm not sure whether we've run out, we don't have time for questions.
Yeah, I think let's do about 3 if we can, and we can call you guys back for technical expertise if we need to. Yeah. Okay, where are we, Ian? Yeah.
Just quickly, are there any other countries pursuing these types of underground facilities in which they don't actually produce the radioactive material themselves? So purely just for a financial gain?
The answer to that is no. However, some other countries have looked at it, but no, there is no other country looking at this as a commercial opportunity. However, clearly there are countries that are looking at it to solve their own waste problem.
Hang on, just wait for the mic. Thanks, Viv.
So I can just add that there are countries that have other concepts. So, for example, the Russians, to support the export of their nuclear power plants, not only supply the plant and provide the finance, but fuel it and take back the fuel. So there are other concepts. There are other countries that, of course, reprocess fuel. Both France and the UK were doing that. The UK won't be doing that for very much longer, but France will continue to do so. So there are other countries that do engage in waste disposal activities associated with nuclear.
But to be very clear, not specifically what we're talking about. It is related to the selling of other products. So in Russia's case, it's a selling point to sell nuclear power plants, for example. There is some work being done by a consortium of countries looking at regional waste disposal facilities, but largely to just manage, not necessarily in a commercial sense, the world's nuclear waste. Sorry, you wanted to disagree with me?
No, he answered my question.
Oh, very good.
I think I probably speak for many of us that we're extraordinarily grateful for you and the team to have put in so much hard work in producing the report, and thank you also for distilling some of it for our benefit. However, you make it clear that the Commission has no responsibility for education of the community at large. We're, as it were, a sample to be educated, and in spite of what Lucy said at the end, social and community acceptance often comes in small print right at the end of your various things, which is appropriate for you. However, I believe our task is even harder than your task, and fundamental to that is the lack of adequate scientific knowledge, which goes from school up through university up to adulthood. And I'm delighted that you're familiar with things like background radiation and can toss around terms like isotopes and all that sort of terminology. But just think of what our job will be. We have, and who is going to support and fund the necessary education of our fellow citizens, because I think it's fundamental to what we're doing.
Look, I totally agree. You have a far bigger challenge than we had. We were dedicated, we had plenty of resources, you know, and we had time as well. So you do have a big challenge because you clearly need to inform yourselves to a point where you are comfortable enough to be able to make an informed decision. So it is a big challenge. It's a very interesting topic, and I think that you will, I did anyhow, enjoyed the process. That's my point. That's my point. So I had the advantage of doing nothing else. It is a big challenge that's confronting you, and I don't underestimate it. I guess the sooner you can get past the noise that you're going to be confronted with and start to focus in on, you know, the real issues here and the real facts, the quicker you will get to that point. But whilst it might be an interesting journey, I certainly agree you've got a great challenge, or a big challenge, and I wish you all the best in that. I'm sure at the end of the day you'll make the right decisions, or at least provide the right advice.
I have maybe one of the last questions that we'll have time for. With the main focus being economic and around potential revenue that can be raised through storing the nuclear waste, I'm wondering how far along discussions have been or proposals have been put forward around what the priority investments will be for the available revenue and how that will actually reach each member of the community.
Okay, we clearly gave some thought to how this money might be spent. It's not brought out in the report because at the end of the day we decided that it wasn't our decision to say how this was spent or how those benefits were shared amongst the community. That's really for the community to determine. A couple of points. I think that clearly we need to be very sure that those benefits will be real, that they will be used for the benefits of the community, not just this one but our future generations, and that they are put to that huge source of funds that would be available just sitting in that fund, not the bit that we're going to live off, are actually invested really smartly in, well, the world's our oyster in what the opportunities are. And I think that would be an interesting discussion to be part of.
Okay.
Chad just said have a look at 106 and 107. I'm not sure why, but...
Because he just likes page numbers, maybe.
I'm just trying to be fast. We did address the State Wealth Fund. We addressed a reserve fund, which would need to be for managing long-term safety. We dealt with issues of research and scientific centres of excellence. I don't think as a matter of democratic principle it was appropriate for Royal Commission to be telling the government how it might spend money where it wanted to engage in the activity, but plainly they are issues that would need to be confronted by those that were minded to establish a fund. I think the Commission went as far as saying that there would need to be a statutory fund of some kind with statutorily created rules. The other thing it did say was that with respect to the community that took on being a host of such facility, that clearly funds would need to flow to it, and there would need to be some appropriate range of benefits agreed as part of the discussion process, that were it minded to proceed, what the benefits would be and how they would fund future generations. And the community would have an interest in defining that for itself, because of course it's for that community to decide what its values are.
Okay, lovely, beautiful note to finish on. And Chris, you stole my thunder, but what a wealth of knowledge. And we've just, as I said, we've had a real sort of slam experience through what was obviously a really thorough one. Throughout the next 3.5 days, we'll have the chance to draw back down on that knowledge bank. So can you join me in thanking the Royal Commission staff?
And
Good job.
thank you for your time. All the best with the journey. I'm sure you'll enjoy it.
Emily, can I get a late...